BBC News with Sue Montgomery. The latest rocket launch by North Korea has prompted both Japan and South Korea to issue alerts, urging citizens to prepare to evacuate or take shelter. Both countries rescinded the warnings a short time later. Grant Ferret reports.
South Korea's military said the North had described the projectile as a space launch vehicle. Sirens were heard across Seoul, which has a population of nearly 10 million, but the authorities later said an evacuation warning had been given in error. The Japanese military said the object could be a ballistic missile heading towards the southern region of Okinawa, before later saying it had already fallen into the sea. Earlier, North Korea said it planned to launch a spy satellite within weeks, saying it was needed to monitor military activities by the United States and its allies.
NATO has announced the deployment of an extra 700 troops to Kosovo after 30 peacekeepers were hurt in clashes with protesters on Monday. The head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, described the violence as unacceptable. The unrest was sparked when ethnic Albanian mayors took office in Serb-majority areas, as Guy Deloney explains.
Well, this all goes back to last month's bodged elections, these bodged mayoral elections in majority Serb North Kosovo. Ethnic Serb parties and voters staged a boycott, and that resulted in an extremely low turnout, just 3.5%. And that meant that ethnic Albanian candidates got elected as mayors in 4 very large majority Serb towns in North Kosovo. Now, Kosovo's international supporters, chief among them the United States, quickly saw that as a problem.
Brazil is hosting the largest summit of South American leaders for nearly a decade. In his opening speech, the Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, urged his counterparts to put aside ideological differences in favour of unity. Here's Will Grant.
This was the first gathering of the South American nations for 9 years, as greater regional integration was halted under President Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. We let ideology divide us and interrupt our efforts to integrate. We all lost because of it, said Lula. The 12 countries heeded the call to attend the summit in Brasilia shows there is appetite for regional cooperation in South America, particularly in areas of shared interests such as security, finance and climate change.
The trial of a man accused of carrying out the deadliest ever attack against Jewish people in the United States has heard that he methodically shot his victims at close range. Robert Bowers faces a possible death sentence if found guilty of 11 killings at a synagogue in Pittsburgh 5 years ago. World News from the BBC. The disgraced entrepreneur Elizabeth Holmes has arrived at a US prison to begin an 11-year sentence. She reported to the facility in Texas after a court rejected her request to remain free on bail. Ms. Holmes was convicted of fraud last year for duping some of the world's richest investors into backing her failed blood testing company Theranos. James Clayton reports.
It's a spectacular fall from grace for someone once touted as the next Steve Jobs. She had claimed to have invented an incredible new process to diagnose hundreds of diseases with just a few drops of blood. But those claims weren't true, and a court found last year that she'd committed fraud. She leaves behind a nearly 2-year-old son who was born weeks before the start of her trial, and a 3-month-old daughter who was conceived after her conviction. However, many investors who lost out believe that prison time is a fair punishment for her crimes. Holmes is appealing the verdict, but she'll have to do so now from a prison cell.
President Putin has promised to improve air defences around Moscow after the city was hit by a drone strike, described as the most dangerous attack on Russia's capital since the Second World War. Mr. Putin accused Ukraine of provoking Moscow into responding in kind. Russia's foreign ministry said the West was pushing the Ukrainian leadership towards ever more reckless criminal deeds, including acts of terrorism. The Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki has arrived in Moscow for a 4-day official visit to Russia at the invitation of President Putin. Eritrea is one of the few countries that have voted against UN resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Reports from Burkina Faso say around 40 people were killed in 2 separate attacks by alleged jihadists at the weekend. Around 20 army volunteers died close to the Malian border on Saturday. BBC News.